That that should do it. Oh boy, okay. Well, sometimes I have to check these things. Oh yeah, you know what? I just had a Windows update. So I'm Aesop Grimm. Welcome to the channel, everybody. I am doing part 5, I think this is, of a read-through of The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, and I needed to reset my mic to my headphones, my headset. Because I recently did a Windows update and it always sends it back to default whenever I do that, or it does most of the time. Okay, I will admit to you guys, I'm a little bit pressed for time today. I haven't done this in a while. It's been a few days. It's been a while since I did my last episode. And so my recap that I'm going to do here is going to be kind of on the fly. I'm not really as well prepared as I normally would be. But glancing back, I know we went over the first of 3 speeches given by C.S. Lewis at Durham University, and the first one was titled Men Without Chests. And I'm not going to recap that. You can find recaps of it in previous episodes, but we are now in The Way. And so what he is bringing up here is he's beginning to disassemble, I guess. I suppose a term that I've heard used in our modern era is deconstruct the argument for a utilitarian view on how you create morals and virtues as motivations. So what he goes over is he says that the utilitarian approach, and he doesn't really call it that. That's a term that I learned when taking a philosophy class in college. But I believe that I'm referencing the same concept that he is. And he says, for example, let's just read a little bit. In actual fact, Gaius Anticius will be found to hold with complete uncritical dogmatism the whole system of values which happened to be in vogue among moderately educated young men of the professional classes during the period between the 2 wars. So what he's saying here is that Gaius Anticius, on the one hand, are trying to say that your views don't hold up because they're subjective. They're just your views, and you're actually speaking about your emotions about a certain thing rather than thinking about objective value. But on the other hand, all of the things that they hold to be the reasons for why they can state that with confidence as an accusation, they're holding those things to be absolute truth. So again, their argument's kind of imploding. It just attacks itself. He goes on later in that same paragraph, a great many of those who debunk traditional or, as they would say, sentimental values, remember this was written in 1943, have in the background values of their own which they believe to be immune from the debunking process. We still see this methodology to this very day. Let us continue to use previous example. Let's skip forward a little bit. He has brought into the language or into the argument a new title now that he calls the innovator, and what he's referencing is the new think man, the person who fancies themselves to be, we would call them a progressive liberal today, the person that fancies themselves to be on the forward edge of the envelope, moving into the future, looking back with some degree of disgust and disdain and wonderment at how stupid people in the past were, right? And critiquing, like you get this a lot, critiquing the boomers, right, for their old archaic stance. That's what we would be familiar with that today. So they would be the innovator because they view themselves as being new and radical and out in front. That's the whole thing behind the idea of progressive, right? And it's funny because if you actually look into that, what you find out is that they're not progressive at all. For one, they're regressive. And for two, they are not on the forward edge of anything. They're actually part of a bygone era. We are in the era of postmodernism. It comes with its own unique problems, some of which I've spoken about in previous episodes. But the era of progressivism belongs to the era of modernity, where it has this idea of one size fits all. Science is the answer to everything, or what we have scientifically proven is the answer for all people, and anybody who thinks differently is just an old fuddy-duddy. Well, I mean, oftentimes what you find out is, that's not very scientific. That's not a very scientific statement. That's actually a pretty dogmatic statement. B, science is changing all the time, and what we believe to be true in the moment, well, you find out months or years or decades down the road that it's completely false. So that's what C.S. Lewis is addressing now. So he has this term, the innovator, and he says this: at this point, the innovator may ask why, after all, selfishness should be more rational or intelligent than altruism. The innovator may ask why, after all, selfishness should be more rational or intelligent than altruism. The question is welcome, if by reason we mean the process actually employed by Gaius and Titius when engaged in debunking, that is, the connecting by inference of propositions ultimately derived from sense data with further propositions, then the answer must be that a refusal to sacrifice oneself is no more rational than a consent to do so. So there's a central example C.S. Lewis is using within the context of 1943. This is World War II, right? He's saying that if you take the view of Gaius and Titius, this was mentioned in The Way of the Chest. The problem that you run into is that you have no traditional virtues, no moral ground in order to call upon young men to sacrifice themselves for the good of their society. Right, and the preservation of their society and their, I just blanked on the word I was going to say, but the members that make up their society. And so that's what he's arguing here. Ultimately derived from sense data then the answer must be that a refusal to sacrifice oneself is no more rational than a consent to do so, and no less rational. Neither choice is rational or irrational at all. From propositions about fact alone, no practical conclusion can ever be drawn. See, he's saying this is the conundrum that you're creating, but with this new way of thinking. This will preserve society, cannot lead to do this except by the mediation of society ought to be preserved. And it's that ought. I've heard modern day debates over this, where the side that wants to get rid of traditional values doesn't like that notion of what you ought to do, because they feel like it's an old, archaic obligation that amounts to a construct that society created as opposed to a truth, and they don't want to be held to that standard. They think it's wrong. But C.S. Lewis has shown, look at this in the context of war. And when you need people to step up and sacrifice for an overall good, this will preserve society. He has that in italics. Cannot lead to do this except by the mediation of society ought to be preserved. So you have an ought involved there. This will cost you your life, cannot lead directly to do not do this. It can lead to it only through a felt desire or an acknowledged duty of self-preservation. The innovator is trying to get a conclusion in the imperative mood. This has to do with Greek, and I would have to refresh myself on this to be able to break this down for you. But man, I studied this. I wish I could bring it to you. I feel like I'm failing you here because I know about these things and I just can't remember it. The innovator is trying to get a conclusion in the imperative mood. The imperative mood, it's kind of coming back to me, is a command. It's an order. That it's a conjugation in Greek that has to do with giving a command. That's the closest I can get to it. And I don't think conjugation is quite right. But remember, this is Old Greek too, that I'm discussing. But these moods apply to, actually, I think they apply to all languages. It's a conclusion in the imperative mood, which is a command mood, out of the premises, which is in the indicative mood. And that's the part I can't quite remember. And though he continues trying to all eternity, he cannot succeed, for the thing is impossible. We must therefore either extend the word reason to include what our ancestors called practical reason, and confess that judgments such as society ought to be preserved are not mere sentiments, but are rationality itself. Or else we must give up at once and forever the attempt to find a core of rational value behind all the sentiments we have debunked. The innovator will not take the first alternative, for practical principles known to all men by reason are simply the Tao, which he has set out to supersede. Remember, the Tao is C.S. Lewis's word to represent all of the generally agreed upon goods and bads that cultures and civilizations throughout multiple eras in all of human history all over the globe have agreed upon. So, for example, thou shalt not murder. That's a biblical commandment, right? But most cultures across a whole slew of eras have agreed murder is bad. But this new way of thinking is trying to reject all of that and saying all of those things are simply constructs. So I'm going to skip down some more. Oh, yeah. And so then C.S. Lewis says the next excuse that they would trot out is that we would be able to ask people to go to war and put their lives on the line because instinct tells us that society is to be preserved. This is the kind of argument that you often will get from a naturalist, somebody who believes in evolution. They will just tell you that every species out there evolved and developed an instinct for self-preservation. And then in mankind, and also in certain aspects, I guess, of the animal kingdom, that extends to an instinct to protect the community. But C.S. Lewis does not believe that this is a good argument. And I want to try and find where he brings up instinct so we can just read it. In reality, we have not advanced one step. I will not insist on the point that instinct is a name for we know not what. To say that migratory birds find their way by instinct is only to say that we do not know how migratory birds find their way. For I think it is here being used in a fairly definite sense to mean an unreflective or spontaneous impulse widely felt by the members of a given species. An unreflective or spontaneous impulse widely felt by the members of a given species. In what way does instinct thus conceived help us to find real values? Is it maintained that we must obey instinct, that we cannot do otherwise? But if so, why are green books and the like written? Why this stream of exhortation to drive us where we cannot help going? Why such praise for those who have submitted to the inevitable? Or is it maintained that if we do obey instinct, we shall be happy and satisfied? So see, I see what he's doing. He's saying his position is that virtues have to be taught. They're not something that you're born into. And if you're, again, that was something brought up in The Way of the Chest. And if you're not teaching people correct virtues, then your society inevitably will run into some catastrophe. And he's saying that the opposing side, whenever they're pressed with these questions that kind of poke holes in their theory, they want to lean on something like instinct. And they want to use that as a sort of suitable substitution for a virtue system. And C.S. Lewis is saying, you can't. That doesn't make any sense. So, is it maintained if we do obey instinct, we shall be happy and satisfied? But the very question we are considering was that of facing death, which, so far as the innovator knows, cuts off every possible satisfaction. And if we have an instinctive desire for the good of posterity, then this desire, by the very nature of the case, can never be satisfied, since its aim is achieved, if at all, when we are dead. He's talking about dulce decorum, right? How sweet it is to die for an honorable cause, I think, is how that would be the decorum part. It looks very much as if the innovator would have to say, not that we must obey instinct, nor that it will satisfy us to do so, but that we ought to obey it. But why ought we obey instinct? Is there another instinct of a higher order directing us to do so, and a third of a still higher order directing us to obey it? An infinite regress of instincts? This is presumably impossible, but nothing else will serve. From the statement about psychological fact, I have an impulse to do so and so. We cannot, by any ingenuity, derive the practical principle, I ought to obey this impulse. Even if it were true that men had a spontaneous, unreflective impulse to sacrifice their own lives for the preservation of their fellows, it remains a quite separate question whether this is an impulse they should control or one they should indulge. For even the innovator admits that many impulses, those which conflict with the preservation of the species, have to be controlled. And this admission surely introduces us to a yet more fundamental difficulty. Telling us to obey instinct is like telling us to obey people. People say different things. So do instincts. Our instincts are at war. If it is held that the instinct for preserving the species should always be obeyed at the expense of other instincts, whence do we derive this rule of precedence? To listen to that instinct speaking in its own cause and deciding in its own favor would be rather simple-minded. Each instinct, if you listen to it, will claim to be gratified at the expense of all the rest. By the very act of listening to one rather than to others, we have already prejudged the case. If we did not bring to the examination of our instincts a knowledge of their comparative dignity, we could never learn it from them. And that knowledge cannot itself be instinctive. The judge cannot be one of the parties judged. Or, if he is, the decision is worthless, and there is no ground for placing the preservation of the species above self-preservation or sexual appetite. The idea that, without appealing to any court higher than the instincts themselves, we can yet find grounds for preferring one instinct above its fellows dies very hard. We grasp at useless words. We call it the basic, or fundamental, or primal, or deepest instinct. If it is of no avail, it is of no avail. Either these words conceal a value judgment passed upon the instinct and therefore not derivable from it, or else they merely record its felt intensity, the frequency of its operation, and its wide distribution. If the former, the whole attempt to base value upon instinct has been abandoned. If the latter, these observations without the quantitative aspects of a psychological event lead to no practical conclusion. It is the old dilemma. Either the premises already concealed an imperative, or the conclusion remains merely in the indicative. Okay, and I believe that brings me to where we had left off. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 paragraphs to go in this chapter. I think we'll probably get half of that done. But this is a good point to go ahead and bring us to the Be Right Back screen. And, okay, good. Audio input is still there. You can find my Rumble and my Kick URLs up at the top left and top right. I am going to be turning YouTube and Twitch off now. This kind of content, it has the potential to derive reactions from me, and I want to be able to speak freely. I don't feel good about being able to speak freely on platforms like YouTube and Twitch, but Rumble and Kick, I do exactly feel that. So we will go ahead and turn those sites off right now. Let's see here. Okay, I'm turning YouTube and Twitch off right now.